Well, thank you, Pat. Yes, it's true. My events connected with this novel have usually precipitated a blizzard, so we're lucky that we didn't have one today. So thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to the friends of the Penn Library. I should also want to introduce Emily Quackenbush from Long's Cards and Books. They've been really an important part of the success of this project, and Emily has books to sell. There'll probably be a big line afterwards, so if you wanted to slip over there partway through the meeting and get one, that would be fine. I'm hoping to talk about the novel without giving away the plot, because I'm sure there are some people here who haven't read it, and so I'm not issuing any spoiler alert, but I will talk about some aspects of the background of the novel, particularly once my eyes adjust to the light. So, in addition to thanking Long's and the library, I do want to express the sense that Don and I have of our gratitude to the Penn and Yates County community, because we've discovered after moving here that this part of the world is just steeped in 19th century history, and including the history of the Civil War. We both started researching this book before we moved here, I'd say about 6 years ago, but I don't think, I'm not sure I would have finished the book if we hadn't come here, and certainly would have been a lot less interesting. The things we've learned around here have really enriched our efforts. I wouldn't have known, for example, about the Wide Awakes. And the Wide Awakes were sort of a youth militia, unarmed, but they wanted to be sure that the 1860 election wasn't stolen by the Democrats. They wanted to be sure that the votes for Lincoln were counted fairly. And they specialized in torchlight parades. They wore oilcloth black capes and caps, usually with an eagle. And I made this time based on a photograph of a Wide Awake parade in New York City for one of our events at the Yates County History Center. But on a chilly night in October 1860, the Yates County Wide Awakes staged a torchlight parade out here on Main Street. According to the newspaper reports, they lit Main Street from one end to the other. Wide Awake companies came from Canandaigua and Geneva to participate. There were fireworks, a brass band played, choir sang. Really a tremendous event. And you know, as much as I love Starshine and Cruisin' Night, some of the things that used to happen on Main Street were even more exciting than those. So the Wide Awakes were fun to learn about. I never would have known about the Wesleyan Methodist Church, so close to us here where we sit. This church was an abolitionist church. I'm sure you all recognize it. Now it's used for apartments. But it was also a hotbed of the women's rights movement. And in fact, there was a women's rights convention here before the one in Seneca Falls. But in September 1861, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist speaker, came here and gave a speech to fire up the community as the Civil War got well and truly underway. The next year, on July 4th, 1862, Frederick Douglass spoke in Himrod, and perhaps some of you attended the reenactment of that Himrod speech we did 150 years after it took place. When I say we, I mean the Yates County History Center. And that reminds me of a point I should have mentioned at the beginning, but one of the great things about this community is its consciousness of its history. Yates County history is being preserved here at the library. It's being preserved at the History Center, and also by so many individuals and authors. I was thinking about a book published recently by Wayne Hood called Fight All Day, March All Night. I'm sure it's available here at the library, but you can also buy a copy at the History Center. It's about one Yates County winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor, Morris Brown Jr., who participated in that torchlight parade I mentioned. And at Gettysburg with a very small number of men. He captured 50 Confederates and 2 or 3 Confederate regimental flags, which was a big deal back in those days. I think about Rich McAlpine writing his articles for the newsletter of the History Center, Jerry and Sue Lang and their work on the Yates heritage tours. There's just so much going on in this area, and I think we should all be proud of what folks are doing to preserve Yates County history. Well, if we hadn't moved here also, I wouldn't have known anything about the Yates County Courthouse. And the courthouse goes back to 1835. That park there, which is so close to us here today, was the site often of public meetings and rallies before the Civil War got underway and after the fighting began. For example, in 1856, the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who was a noted abolitionist, was caned on the floor of the Senate by a member of the House, a Southerner, who came over and almost killed Charles Sumner. Well, when word of that reached Penn by the telegraph, a spontaneous meeting occurred here at the courthouse. They called it an indignation meeting. It was kind of an early flash mob. And they passed a number of resolutions condemning slavery, condemning the attack on Sumner. Later on, in May of 1861, when the first Yates soldiers, known as Keuka Rifles, went off to war, they left from the courthouse. And actually, there's another slide here of the courthouse today. And then the next slide shows a reenactment we did at the History Center of the departure of the Keuka Rifles. This is a leading citizen, Darius Ogden, whom you might recognize as Rich McAlpin, who he gave every soldier before they left for the war a copy of the New Testament. And the next slide parade was led by veterans of the War of 1812, and you might recognize some of these guys. Anyway, they went off to catch the train. Next slide. This is an engine of the Northern Central Railroad, and to take the train down to Elmira, where they camped for a while before going down to Washington. So the courthouse was so important, and of course it's got that wonderful Civil War monument, which is well worth your time to go over and study. Yates County wasn't just a hotbed of abolitionism, however. We also had our citizens who either sympathized with the South or they just couldn't see the point of having a war. And later on they became known affectionately as Copperheads, Northerners who sympathized with the South. But they had their own newspaper, the Penn Democrat, and its great rival was the Yates County Chronicle, ancestor of the Chronicle Express, a Republican newspaper. Hi, man, there's a seat right up front. The Chronicle Express, the Yates County Chronicle and its editor, Stafford Cleveland, engaged in vituperative debates all through the war. And if you think about the wide awake parade I was talking about, and this turmoil in the press, sometimes I'm struck today, and it seems in Yates County we don't discuss politics with anyone unless we already know that they agree with us. I guess, we're a small community and we don't have a lot of discord. But back then, in 1860, politics were discussed and everything was very active. And people weren't quite as shy about their political beliefs as they are today. Also, if I hadn't moved here, I wouldn't have known about the contribution that Yates County soldiers made during the Civil War. More than 2,000 Yates County soldiers went off, and the figures are over there on the monument. I think the population was only about 22,000 at that time, so a very large proportion. If you think how many of those 22,000 were young men ready for battle, It's a huge proportion that went off. I can't go over all their historic deeds here, but many headed south on the northern central, down to Elmira. Then they would go on to Baltimore, passing through the Calvert Street station. It's interesting that Lincoln passed through this station on his way up into Pennsylvania to give the Gettysburg Address. But then they had to walk across town to the Camden Street station. To get the train to Washington. You couldn't just get a train from Penn or Elmira all the way to Washington. You had to walk across Baltimore. And that was, if you read about the Massachusetts infantry unit that encountered a riot when they were taking that walk. But this Camden Street station, interestingly, is still there today. It's now the something like the Sports Legends Museum, because the Baltimore Ravens, the football team, and the Baltimore Orioles have their stadiums right next door. So it's too bad it's not still a train station, but at least it's preserved and you can visit. And they went on down to Washington, where large numbers were encamped on Meridian Hill. And here's a photo of Meridian Hill. The first Yates County fatality in the war occurred here in this camp, where they had a terrible problem with dysentery and disease. So William Riker came back in the summer of 1861. There was a parade and a funeral, and you can still visit his grave over at the Lakeview Cemetery. I can't really identify this building behind, but it's always struck me as so strange. Here you have the soldiers encamped well, on the edge of a city, but the city life is going on, and people are living normal lives, and these poor guys are out here in tents, suffering all kinds of illness. So what did our soldiers do down there? Well, for one thing, they guarded the Chain Bridge. And this is a bridge, it's kind of the back door to Washington from Northern Virginia, if you're coming in from McLean or any of those areas out there. So you can see the Union soldiers here. And that was one of the great functions of the troops from New York State, was to protect the capital from the Confederates. Now, this bridge, if they thought there were Confederates in the area, they would actually take up the planks at night, or some of the planks, so that a Confederate raiding party couldn't come across and attack Washington. There's another picture of Chain Bridge. I guess when Donna and I lived in Washington, we crossed the modern version of this bridge hundreds of times. It's still an important way to get into Washington. Yates County soldiers were out in Centerville. I think we have a slide of that. This is not very far from where Dulles Airport is today, but so it's out from Washington. They're protecting the capital, and it was from here that Yates soldiers were dispatched, their regiments, to follow General Lee as he came up to the west and went up toward Gettysburg. These soldiers went up on the east side of that army, and for the fatal, the great confrontation at Gettysburg, where again Yates County soldiers played a very important role. Later on, soldiers of the 85th New York Regiment were part of the Union elements which went down to the Carolina coast, trying to cut the Confederates off from access to the sea. And many of them went to Plymouth, North Carolina, which is another interesting place to visit. They have a battle reenactment there every April. There's a museum, and lots to see there. So if we could have the next picture, I think we're in Plymouth. A great battle was fought there in 1864. The Confederates launched a surprise attack against the Union soldiers at Plymouth. And they had secretly built an ironclad, we can have the next picture, farther up the river, and called the Albemarle. And that came down, and they sank the Union vessels at Plymouth, North Carolina, and captured everyone who wasn't killed, including many Yates County soldiers, who then found themselves going to Andersonville. And here you see soldiers, fresh prisoners arriving at Andersonville. After the war, there was a parade in Penn where one of the survivors of Andersonville rode in a wagon, and the newspaper accounts talk about how shocked everybody was to see how emaciated this person was. So that was, but there were Yates County soldiers there too. So that's an important part of the background of Benediction, Yates County history and the role that our soldiers played in the war. And if you've read the book, you might recognize some of these places and stories. Most everything in the novel took place in one way or another, just not necessarily all to the same people, but most of it has got a strong factual basis. Well, I wanted to talk about a couple of other aspects of the background to the novel, and one is the connection between this part of New York State and the Chesapeake Bay, which I suppose is not something you think about a lot, but it was really that connection which was the source of the idea that led me to imagine everything else that followed in the novel. And in Donna's family, there's a legend of someone, an ancestor from Seneca Castle, who once took a load of cabbages over to Geneva, put them on a barge, or an ark as they called it, and went all the way down Seneca Lake to the Chesapeake Bay. And I've always wondered if that could be true. It interested me because I spent a lot of my life in and around Baltimore, and I never thought of that part of the world as particularly connected to this part of the world. But this ancestor of Donna's had the idea that since there were a lot of Germans in Baltimore, there must be a lot of sauerkraut that they could use as cabbages. So, next slide. And we found this on it. People were proud of their cabbages in those days. This is actually from the 1870s. But it gives you an idea of how large New York State cabbage could be. If you drive around here, you know that in the fall anyway. You see them in the fields. And then next, this is over at the Geneva Historical Society, this picture of a steamship. This is also from the 1870s, pulling all these arcs behind it, heading south toward Watkins. And so that made me think this legend in Donna's family might really be true. How could they get from Geneva to the Chesapeake Bay? Well, the next slide, there's an ark. Just imagine that filled with cabbages. Whatever, and then moving on. The Chemung Canal went from Watkins, as it then was, down to Elmira, to the Chemung River. And if you hike on, I think they say the Catharine Valley Trail, you're walking along what remains of that canal. And so this was the connection. In fact, there's Gary Emerson, an historian and high school teacher, has written a book called The Link in the Great Chain. And this is what he calls the link. Because it connected the whole Erie Canal system to the Chesapeake Bay system. Unfortunately, the Susquehanna, if you've driven along it, is not very navigable. And you pretty much have to, if you're going to get down there, go in the early spring when the water's high, which is what I imagined in the book that the young man from Seneca Castle did. Moving on to the next slide, just the Susquehanna, and on beyond. Next, this is where the Susquehanna terminates at Havre de Grace, Maryland. Now Donna's ancestor might have dropped the cabbages off at a place called Port Deposit, because from the name, you can tell, he would have sold the cabbages and the ark would have been sold for timber, or thinking he might make more money if he went directly to Baltimore, he might have gone out into the Chesapeake and been towed down to Baltimore, just as this steamboat is towing other vessels in the opposite direction. Well, where would such a person have gone in Baltimore? Well, the German population in those days was centered around Fells Point. And if we could have the next slide. I was always, one thing that interested me about this story in Donna's family, what about this young man from rural western New York suddenly finds himself in Baltimore, what would that be like? And this is by a Baltimore artist, James Shepard, and it's a painting of Fells Point in the 19th century. And you can see there's a lot going on here. There are a couple of sailors who look kind of drunk, and here's a guy guarding probably a bouncer at a bar, a woman in the doorway here, maybe up there too. And then these great ships, you know, could be from anywhere in the world. Fells Point was big for the import of coffee from South America, for example, so that they could be carrying coffee. And then I've always loved this, you know, innocent mother and daughter making their way through all of this. So landing at Fells Point, I think would have been a pretty shocking experience. And if we look at the next slide, you can see there's still plenty of places for a young man to get into trouble in Fells Point and maybe drink a little too much. But I did want to mention, if you're ever down the Baltimore way, visiting Fells Point is quite an interesting thing to do. The next slide is a little more touristy. That's what it looks like today. And this ship here is the Pride of Baltimore II, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So that connection is an important part of the novel for me. The second area of background I wanted to discuss was the Southern drive to renew the African slave trade. And this is a key part of the novel as well. You might have thought that the African slave trade ended in 1808. And that's what I thought for most of my life. The Constitution said that no law could be passed prohibiting the slave trade until 1808, but in that year Congress did in fact ban the trade. And then in 1820 another law was passed to make participation in the slave trade, the international slave trade, a hanging offense. So we did have strong laws against the slave trade, and I had always thought, well, that was it as far as the slave trade with Africa is concerned. But then later on, doing some reading, actually W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a subject that fascinated him, I learned that, in fact, there were illegal slave voyages to Africa, and particularly as we get close to the Civil War. And this ship is one of the most notorious participants in that illegal slave trade. This is the Wanderer, which was a large, fast yacht, which went to the Congo, about the Congo River in 1858. And they say the estimate of the number of slaves brought back was 400 to 600 on what you can see is not a very large boat. We'll get back to that a little bit more. You might be able to tell that here the Wanderer is flying an American flag. Well, it was captured at the beginning of the Civil War and made into a Union naval vessel. So, in researching the book, Don and I went down and took a close look at the Pride of Baltimore II. I've never told those folks that their ship might be the model for the one in the novel. But the Pride of Baltimore II, which you might be able to ride on if you go down to Baltimore and visit the Inner Harbor. If it's in town, they offer trips on it. But it's a recreated Baltimore clipper ship and another very fast sailing boat. I've got a couple of more just there. Don and I took a little cruise on the Wanderer, and it was quite fascinating to see, first of all, a very small number of men, although these days there are many women in the crew, could take a ship like this, you know, maybe 20 men, and go anywhere in the world. Didn't need a lot of gas. Yeah.
Did you take that photo from the crow's nest of another clipper?
No, these are just... Yeah, I was up there in a helicopter. But then you see the crew works with great precision, and the captain will say, he's standing, there's a man at the wheel, and the captain's standing behind him. The captain will say, quarter turn to the right, and the wheelman will repeat, quarter turn to the right before doing it. And then when they come back into the Baltimore Harbor, they always fire their cannon off to make all the tourists jump out of their skin. So that's a fun thing to do. I guess this is partly a travel log or places you could go. Plymouth, North Carolina, the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, Meridian Hill in Washington, all interesting places to visit. Well, the United States had these laws against participation in the slave trade, but they weren't really being enforced very well. And this upset the British. In Britain, the slave trade was outlawed in 1807 and throughout the British Empire. And then in 1833, slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire. And Britain took it upon itself to end the slave trade. It was kind of their international humanitarian role of the time. And they were disturbed that the United States wasn't enforcing its laws. So in 1842, they insisted that we send a squadron to Africa, off the African coast, to enforce our own laws against the slave trade. And that was a part of the negotiation over settling the Canadian border just to the north here, over to Maine. The British refused to agree to settle that border until we agreed to send the African squadron over. And while you're in Baltimore, you might see the USS Constellation, which is now in the Baltimore Harbor. For a time at the end of the 1850s and up until the Civil War, this was the flagship of the African squadron, based in Cape Verde and then more toward the African coast later on. But you can see that if, remember the Pride of Baltimore, what if there were a race between the Pride of Baltimore and this ship? You can get a pretty good idea of who's going to win. And although in 1860, the Constellation did capture the Cora, which was a ship based in New York, which had 705 slaves on board, probably going to Brazil. And I should mention that about the illegal slave trade. Most of the Americans involved in that illegal trade were taking slaves to Cuba and Brazil. We only can really prove 2 voyages that came to the United States itself. But throughout the years before the Civil War, there was a lot of suspicion that more was going on. And in fact, if you read the Yates County Chronicle, they would publish paragraphs every now and then about reports of illegal slave ship landing in Florida or Georgia, something like that. But naturally, this wasn't something you wanted to get caught at, since you could be hanged. So the evidence is pretty scanty. But we do know about the Wanderer. The person that set in motion the voyage of the Wanderer was what they call a fire eater. These were true Southern nationalists, Southern expansionists who were so influential in the South before the Civil War. And this fellow's name was Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar. He didn't actually go on the Wanderer, but he arranged the whole voyage and paid for the ship. And he was one of that group who argued that the South needed to have more slaves. That Texas had come into the Union in 1845 as a slave state. Southerners, of course, wanted all the territories to come into the Union as slave states. They wanted Southern California. They had their eye on Cuba and Central America. They thought that the South was going to expand into all these areas. And for them, the idea, well, it was just crystal clear that more slaves were needed. There had been a long history of slaves from Virginia and the border states, where smaller scale agriculture, not plantation systems, being sold south. And if you saw the film 12 Years a Slave, you're aware too that the price of slaves was going up and up because there was a shortage. And so traders would deal and do all sorts of nefarious things to get slaves. A male slave in Virginia in those days was about $1,500 in those dollars, not in today's dollars. So you can imagine if they thought they could go to Africa and buy slaves for $50, there was a fortune to be made. And they didn't apologize, and I would say that for many Southerners, and you can see this in a lot of diaries and books and newspaper articles, there was opposition to renewing the slave trade in Africa. And people saw it as nothing more than kidnapping. They had all of these arguments. We're against going to Africa to buy new slaves. We know that we have slavery here. We know that the sale of slaves takes place every day inside the United States. But even so, they were against renewing the slave trade. They tended to argue that, in fact, the slaves had been brought to the South by New England sea captains, and it wasn't their fault at all. But now they had this burden. They didn't know what to do about it. But in any case, they were against going to Africa for more slaves. But for the fire eaters, there was no question. And they would argue, they would turn the argument around. If selling slaves, buying and selling of slaves is legal within the United States, why should it be illegal to go overseas to buy slaves? Well, in the North, this was really a horrifying idea. It was seen not only as appalling on humanitarian grounds, renewing the slave trade with Africa, but also because it threatened the entire northern system of small farms, small business, manufacturing using free labor. Our neighbor from Auburn, William H. Seward, who became then the Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration, gave a speech in 1858 in which he wrote about the irrepressible conflict. I'll just read the quote to give you an idea of how people felt about renewing the slave trade. It is an irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces, and it means that the United States must and will, sooner or later, become either entirely a slaveholding nation or entirely a free labor nation. Either the cotton and rice fields of South Carolina and the sugar plantations of Louisiana will ultimately be tilled by free labor, and Charleston and New Orleans become marts of legitimate merchandise alone, or else the rye fields and wheat fields of Massachusetts and New York must again be surrendered by their farmers to slave culture and to the production of slaves, and Boston and New York become once more markets for trade in the bodies and souls of men. So there was this great fear that if more slaves were brought to this country, eventually the whole country would become a slave nation. Lamar is an interesting character. Actually, he's called Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, partly because Lafayette was his godfather and attended his baptism. But he eventually became known as the last man because he was the last man known to be killed in the Civil War. And he was killed after Appomattox, after Lee had surrendered. And there was some kind of a dust-up in Columbus, Georgia, several days after Appomattox. And whether he was actually killed in battle or whether he got into an altercation with the Union soldiers and drew his sword, which is one story, and they shot him. We don't know, but it kind of gives you an idea of how fanatical these fire eaters were. Well, we have some slides coming up. Well, this is a slide of the Georgia coast. It gives you an idea of how possible it would have been to sneak a ship in there, unload illegal cargo, and never be detected. Okay. This is the Cotton Wharf in Savannah. I imagine in the novel, the heroine passing through here and just trying to imagine her feelings having left Africa just shortly before. These are some survivors of the Wanderer who Ward Lee kind of became their spokesman. They were interviewed in the press, well known actually. Next. And one of them, an interesting thing about the Wanderer is that this Charles Carr brought over on the Wanderer in 1858, and yet eventually joins the Union Army as a soldier. I think he might have borne a grudge. Next slide, and of course, in the end, this is General Sherman on the eve of the capture of Savannah. So, in a sense, things worked out. Christmas Eve, 1864. Okay, moving along. The other documented illegal slave voyage was from Mobile, and these were not, upper class plantation owners and fire eaters, but just a guy who owned a ship read an article in the newspaper that there had been a war in Dahomey in Africa, and a lot of people had been captured, and they were for sale for $60 a piece. And so he took a ship over there, the Clotilda, to Dahomey, particularly to Ouida, and brought back not as many, maybe 120, to Mobile. Now, the descendants of, those slaves themselves and their descendants lived in, and still live in this neighborhood called Africatown in Mobile, which you can visit. There's a museum there. Of course, now they're dispersed and live all over the area. Yeah, next slide. And this is Cudjoe Lewis, who lived until 1935, came over on the Clotilda. And it underscores, my parents were living in Alabama in 1935. They could have gone over to Africatown and met Cudjoe Lewis. I just mention that because this isn't ancient history. These are recent times. There's one very sad story of some of the people on the Clotilda were being moved from Mobile to Selma for sale, and they crossed paths with a traveling circus, which had an elephant, and the Africans, and their words were written down phonetically, and then afterward, later on, it was realized that they had been speaking Yoruba, their West African language, had been saying, elephant, elephant, home, home. But finally, Cudjoe Lewis, incidentally, was visited by Booker T. Washington and the Harlem Renaissance author Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote a great deal about him. So, yes, finally, I think I'll just close with a picture of Cudjoe Lewis, born a free person in Africa and a slave in Alabama, and then free again with this, I think, a rather touching photo. So if you haven't read the novel, you might wonder how all of this fits in, but
it does.
It does all. It fits in its way. So, okay, thank you.